Hey guys, welcome back. In today's video, we are talking about the big payday, why we can easily see 1k per share, the shorts, red flags, and many more in this video. First, we're taking a look at this. Their overconfidence in thinking they could shake AMC apes out of the commitment to the course will prove to be their undoing. So when we take a look at this and when we take a look at the price of AMC, now everyone should know by now, the price is being manipulated because shorts want to shake people out. However, what they fail to do is to actually shake people out because apes are constantly buying into AMC. If we take a look at this particular post from this user, you can see apes own around 15 to 20 floats, reached my goal of 15,000 AMC shares, next goal 20,000. The longer the delay, the bigger the pay. See my ape fam on the moon, it's MOAS or Moog. We are not leaving. AMC printing revenue Q2 to infinity. And so what we're looking at is how apes have been constantly buying into AMC. Now, going into a post we talked about yesterday, and in terms of the data that's been given to us with the shares that are available divided by the shareholders, is to say that everyone, or at least all the shareholders, owns around 49.66 shares per AMC investors. That will be how many shares every investors need to own in order to completely take up the float that's available, which in this case 198 million shares. However, from this just one particular user. Now, obviously he said that he has his goal, or rather he's reached his goal, so he has 15,000 AMC shares. But even when you just take a look at the buy orders that he's took, we saw this particular screenshot of over 340 shares, and then the second screenshot of 50 shares. So when you take a look at this, him alone, this one particular person alone is already worth that of the average shares of 8 investors. And so we know, again, this isn't true in terms of how shareholders will only have around 50 shares because we know that the float has been sold multiple times over. When we took a look at the calculations used by Biotech Moose, he talked about how 8 times extra floats likely exist. But like I've said, I think that it's much higher than that because when you understand that there are people out here, and he isn't just one of the few. Of course, not everyone has the ability to buy 15,000 AMC shares, but he definitely isn't in that 0.1%. I definitely have seen how multiple people, how a lot of people in fact, has owned a large portion of AMC shares, those with more than 5,000 shares plus. And so you can understand how actually, around 15 to 20 floats and even higher than that is obviously very, very possible. And again, one correct thing in terms of what I agree with here is that the longer the delay, the bigger the pay. And the reason for this is because we talked about the reason why they're able to delay this is because they're creating synthetics. By creating synthetics, they're preventing the price from going up. And so that's how they're delaying it. But like we've said, the more synthetics in which they create, the higher the floor price will be. So you can imagine it as right now, potentially the squeeze price is $1,000, again, for a hypothetical purpose. But because they've created more synthetic shares, the price goes up by $1 for every share they create. So it goes up to 1,001, 1,002, etc., etc. Now, of course, that isn't exactly how it's going to go. But like we understand, when they create more synthetics, the floor price of AMC will also increase with it. And then you can understand how much liquidity and capital is easily available. So we've understood now, because they've sold the float so many times, we're going to be looking at AMC going to an absurd price. And one of the biggest doubts people have is that how can we see AMC? People are doubting the fact that AMC can go to $200. People are doubting the fact AMC can go to $500, $1,000, $5,000. But when you take a look at how much liquidity is in the market and the stocks in which they use to suppress AMC, you will understand why AMC can go that high. You can see, fun fact, yesterday's drop in market cap in Apple and Google together corresponds to $207 per AMC share. And this is with a 1.69% drop in Apple, a 1.66% drop in Alphabet, which is obviously Google. And this is how much it would only take for AMC to go to $207 per share. a 1% drop from both companies. And so when you talk about, is it possible for AMC to see $200, to see $1,000, to see $5,000? Well, yes, it is, because of the money that has been circulating around, because of the stocks they've used to suppress and manipulate AMC. We talked about how they used the Mag 7. We talked about stocks like Nvidia. We talked about other stocks they use. We talked about the tokens in which they've used. And remember, they all carry a value. They carry value so great that even a 10% drop would make AMC go up into the thousands. And so this is why we've said, in terms of why we can see AMC go to $1,000, why we can easily see AMC go to $1,000 per share. And when you understand how many synthetics has been created, why we can also see that as well. And then obviously we just talked about, in terms of creating synthetics, increasing floor price. We talked about how the floor price is easily doable. Now we have to look at then the possibility of the squeeze happening. And for us, it's always been very, very high. The reason why we say this is because we talked about how at the end of the day, they can't hide the synthetics forever. And we've seen weakening in what's happening. But when you take a look at a larger scale, in terms of the banks who are lending out the money to these short sellers who are then suppressing AMC, how are they doing? Well, you can see the potential landmines. What we can see is how they're making articles saying banks keep winning and so do their stocks. But what they fail to talk about is, again, the 5.1 trillion in credit derivatives and credit default swaps made up of 4.2 trillion, in terms of how they're able to pass the stress test, which we'll talk about. And this is why they're making the whole macroeconomy look good. They're making these banks and short sellers look good. But in reality, the truth is so far from that. Because you can see, no wonder banks easily passed the 2025 stress test. The Fed allowed banks to hide a lot of their risk. The Fed ignored trillions of dollars in loans banks made to non-bank financials, i.e. private equity firms, in a critical part of their test. And then you can go on further to see the 490 billion USD of projected losses from NBFI alone aren't included in the total projected losses under the stress test. Furthermore, according to the Fed stress test, Bank of America is expected to lose $23 billion under the most adverse scenario. Now, what's wrong with this? Well, this bank right now already has roughly 100 billion USD of paper losses in its books. And so you can see the situation that we are in right now. But the emphasis on this is in terms of Bank of America, the firm that's being mentioned. We talked about losing 23 billion under the most adverse scenario, but we've also talked about how they have roughly $100 billion of paper losses in its book already. So why is Bank of America important? Well, we've just talked about how big their losses can get. But another thing is about how they're the prime lender for Citadel. That's correct. Citadel get most of their capital from Bank of America. And now these capital are then obviously allocated in order to suppress and manipulate AMC. So if we're going to be seeing how the large proportion of money used to short AMC, to suppress AMC, are now facing massive exposure to risk where they potentially have to recall these loans as we're seeing them losing out on money, you understand why we talked about the possibility of the AMC squeeze is getting higher and higher. Now, of course, there are, other institutions that will also be mentioned that are also involved. We talked about Virtue, we talked about Goldman Sachs. But when we talk about the involvement of Citadel with AMC, we obviously know how deep it is. And then we understand how the reason why Citadel has been getting away with this, how they've been getting away with this, is because of Bank of America, who are now facing massive losses. You see why it's now in our favor, why the ball is now on our side of the court, and why we talked about, yes, they can create more synthetics, but they can't hide it forever. And the more synthetics that they create, obviously the higher the floor price will be. And then you can take a look at another example of they're worried about another Credit Suisse. The IMF has backed Swiss authorities' financial sector reforms, including a controversial proposal for UBS to hold significantly more capital than its peers. And so, To some people, this may just be about Credit Suisse or just about UBS. But to the ones who understand, to the ones who knows, will know how this problem is actually even bigger than what they're projecting to be. Because the reason why they're proposing for UBS to increase their capital is because of the Credit Suisse positions that UBS holds, or more specific, the toxic swaps that Credit Suisse holds, which are now inherited by UBS. Now, we talked about how a large proportion of these swaps obviously consist of toxic GME and AMC swaps, and that's why it's creating problems for these firms. And so institutions and regulations have highlighted just how big these swaps are. And so when I say we can easily reach $1,000 per share, it isn't to say we're only going to be seeing 1,000. Because 1,000 is so easily reachable, I definitely think we're looking at 10K, 15K, and even higher. But yeah, guys, that's it for this video. I'll catch you guys next time.